Don't make me use my stuff on you, baby.
Radio Friendsmith, episode 245. It is still October. It is still frightening season.
What about ghosts?
And with that in mind, I decided to cover a fairly scary black metal band this evening, certainly within the Halloween spirit. And when I say band, like most of the times with good black metal projects, that's a misnomer. It's not a band. It's one guy, name of Charmander Grimlock.
Me Grimlock, no bozo!
Huh.
어플로 주문을 하던가?
Yeah, maybe you're right. Maybe it's supposed to be French, you know, like Charmant. Wacky black metal name aside, Charmander Grimlock is the black metal alias of one Joachim Rigg from Norway. Apparently he makes a decent living nowadays doing interstitial music for TV shows and producing like pop albums. But when he is Charmander Grimlock, that's when he's Emperor's live keyboardist, or at least he was back in the 90s. That's where you might have heard this guy's name before. But we're not talking about Emperor this week. That's too easy. Everybody's already heard Emperor. What do you want me to say about Emperor you haven't already heard? No, we're talking about the guy's main band. See, he was just like a live session dude for Emperor, but he's got his own band called Tartaros from way back in the day. And this band, project, solo outing, whatever, was all about symphonic black metal. And most of the time when I hear symphonic black metal, I don't think of it as being particularly frightening or scary. Usually it's more melancholic, at least the good stuff. Boom, there we go. All these are Svundenhen off the second Dimmu Borgir album. Don't pretend like you didn't buy this 10 years ago and like you're too cool to listen to it now, because no, this shit still slaps. However, it is not very scary or even kind of like cheesy Halloween sounding. It is 100% melancholic, atmospheric black metal. I don't care if they got a song on here called Antichrist with a K. Alright, this shit is not very evil sounding. It's a good album, but it's not evil. Tartaros, however, is one of the few symphonic black metal bands I can think of, outside of like Emperor and Limbonic Art, both of who are also very important Norwegian bands, that goes for a full-on wicked, menacing atmosphere pretty much exclusively. Pretty much as soon as you put this album on, you immediately understand why Emperor ended up hiring this guy to do live keyboards for them. Because his songwriting is total old school Emperor stuff. You got the cleaner guitar playing these like starter arpeggiated phrases in the left channel. You got the lower pitched tremolo guitar playing the distorted primitive riffs in the right channel. They interact very nicely. It's classic In the Nightside Eclipse style guitar playing. Tartaros doesn't immediately hit you over the head with what makes their material unique. They kind of gradually sneak it in over the course of the first song on their first EP, but it takes a little bit before they go full. You can hear a little bit of it in the keyboards right now, but right around here is when it goes way harder with the Halloween shit. Alright, that is some great, goofy, spooky Halloween haunted house music.
I noticed a tendency with this program to get rather silly. Now, I do my best to keep things moving along, but I'm not having things getting silly.
It is perhaps incredibly silly, but Charmander Grimlock manages to make it work by virtue of the fact that he takes it completely seriously. If this music had any level of tongue-in-cheek or purposeful comedy to it, it would ruin the whole experience. Ironically, trying to make it fun is what would take all the fun out of it. Because despite this shit sounding goofy as fuck, it is also deliciously evil and wicked sounding. Just how evil, you might ask? Well, check this song out. Title track on the Grand Psychotic Castle EP. Starts out with this great, almost kind of like mayhem sounding riff right here with that bendy bar chord, but then I think my boy earned himself a nice, low-pitched evil vampire laugh or two. Speaking of low-pitched, I love the spooky clean vocals that show up throughout the album, but the main thing that really sets Tartaros apart are the delightfully evil-sounding, spooky circus keyboards. I love them, and that is what I will always think of when I hear about Tartaros. He's kind of doing what Crypticus does with death metal in a black metal context, if that makes sense. And there's a spooky whip noise, which, if you know anything about symphonic black metal, spooky whip noises are very important. I mean, just look at Obtained Enslavement. Another interesting thing that crops up towards the end of this EP is what you're hearing right now, sort of an industrial pulse to it, kind of electronic sounding. That is actually a very important portent of things to come with Tartaros. Because after this first EP, when it came time for him to record a full-length album, he adopted a much more Moonfog style aesthetic.
You may ask
Jub, what the hell does Moonfog mean? Well, in the barest of terms, Moonfog was a record label started by Satyr from Satyricon to put out all of Satyricon stuff, a bunch of Dark Throne albums, a couple Discipline albums, some Cold albums. But more than that, it applies to a general sort of weird aesthetic undercurrent that crops up in late 90s and early 2000s Norwegian black metal. Because a lot of bands that play the Moonfog sound aren't necessarily signed to Moonfog. Like Mayhem's Grand Declaration of War, obviously that comes out on like Century Media, right? But I would say that album has the Moonfog sound. In fact, I would say the greatest exponent of what the Moonfog sound was doesn't even come from Satyricon. It comes from Snorre Ruch of the one-man project Thorns when he finally got around to putting out a full-length album after over a decade of existence. If you don't know who this guy is, you might remember something that went down in Norway back in 1993, where a guy named Euronymous slipped and fell onto Varg Vikernes' knife 26 times.
A similar story occurred in the state of New Jersey about 20 years ago.
Supposed to be empty here daytimes.
Jesus, my fucking balls!
Yeah, a little something like that. Anyway, Snorre was Varg's driver during that little escapade. But more importantly he's the guy behind Thorns, and he essentially was one of the most important innovators as far as Norwegian black metal style guitar playing goes. And in fact, I believe you can find the roots of the Moonfog style way back in 1990 on some of his early demos. These aren't technically Moonfog style, they're like proto-Moonfog. Like this one here, the classic track, Funeral Marches to the Grave, totally shows off what I mean by proto-Moonfog. You see how dissonant and cold that slowly sliding bar chord riff is? And then coupled with that weird dissonant lead guitar wailing over it. When the proper tremolo picked black metal riffs and double bass drumming kick in, the distinction between this style of black metal and more normal black metal, it becomes even more apparent. In fact, you might even say that bands like Bloodhouse Nord basically got their whole sound from the stuff Snorre was doing back in the 90s. But it's still not quite Moonfog yet. It's proto-Moonfog. He goes full Moonfog when he gets out of jail after, the thing happened. And he even remakes a lot of older Thorn songs to show off that contrast. For instance, here's that song you just heard, but now in its 1999 version, with the Moonfog sound fully on display. You can hear the guitar is much more self-consciously artificial sounding, very synthetic and weird, cybernetic almost. But not in like a cheap way, like he's clearly doing this on purpose for atmospheric effect. And an interesting side effect of that weird guitar sound is when he switches from fluid motion to percussive motion, like right here, it gets this odd crunch to it that wasn't present in early Norwegian stuff. When you have a guitar sound that's this overdriven and synthetic sounding, it makes all the different guitar techniques being utilized stick out way more than they would with like the standard sort of, like warm tube amp, analog tape kind of guitar sound that most people are used to from older metal stuff. And this Moonfog sound, like it or not, and a lot of people really did hate it, showed up all over the place at the time, whether it be on like later Dødheimsgard material or even on some non-Norwegian bands like Trollheim's Grot and Black Dawn from Finland. It's somewhat similar to the Abyss Studio sound that was pioneered by Peter Totgren, but in that case, that more just had to do with the production. In this case, it's not just the production of the music, it's more of that coupled with a peculiar way of playing guitar and like sort of a stranger overall feel to the music. It was supposed to be black metal for the new millennium, essentially. What happens when you take that Moonfog sound and put it in the hands of a crazy person like Charman Grimlock? Well, you get the crowning jewel in Tartaros' discography, that being the full-length album, The Red Jewel. It doesn't start out sounding terribly different from their prior material. They're definitely still going for that evil circus vibe. But once the guitars kick in, That's when the Moonfog vibe really starts to bleed through. I mean, listen to this bizarre riff. It starts out with that really fast flutter strum that immediately goes into that hard guitar accent, sliding a bar chord down the neck. And after this little transition riff right here, this next riff is even weirder. Some really cool two-part action. This right here is the first part, and then this part right here, that was the second part. So you have this sort of weird push-pull dynamic going on between a fairly standard tremolo picked riff and the ending of the riff, which is this weird hammer-on pull-off dissonant guitar figure going back and forth. The other really weird thing about this album is clearly the keyboard's the most complex instrumental part on it, and yet the guitars are much more prominent in the mix than the keyboards are. Some people might think this is a mistake. I actually think it's really interesting. It fits the music well. It makes it feel like all of the other instruments are emanating from the guitars, almost like a spell is being cast. Remember what I mentioned earlier about percussive guitar crunch? That was a big part of the Moonfog sound for Thorns, and that same kind of stuff shows up here. Whenever they hit like a hard stop palm mute with the guitars, that odd synthetic guitar tone makes it hit a lot harder. It's less of a chug and more of a crash. This particularly shows up on the more rhythmically experimental portions of the album. And I do mean rhythmically experimental. This is some weird proggy off-time shit. But it eventually straightens itself out into sort of a near thrash cadence. Or at least as close to normal thrash metal as Tartaros ever gets. Which of course is still very weird, and it goes back into that odd sort of like inside-out waltz riff very quickly. It's like the music is like turning itself over and like bending in on itself. Because there is sort of like a standard 6/8 waltz going on, but it keeps collapsing back into the original root note in this like weird off-time way. This little bar chord transition right here is also very Moonfog, very Grand Declaration of War, but it goes into another thrash riff, probably the thrashiest of the album, and yet it's still very strange with that sliding bar chord inside it, and the fact that the two rhythm guitar channels aren't quite playing the same thing. They're sort of weaving in and out of each other. Also like that really dissonant, wailing anti-solo going over at the top of it. But these percussive sections wouldn't hit as hard if they weren't using that weird synthetic guitar tone that makes everything sound so like clashing and metallic. But it's not just the more, 80s-ish thrash metal sections that stick out on this album for me. Some of the best moments are hyper-modern Norwegian black metal, dissonant bar chord style guitar playing. Like the final song on the album has a lot of riffs like this that almost sound like a much more cybernetic, updated version of Mayhem's De Mysterious Dawn Sathanas, complete with a very prominent bass guitar. And the song is willing to ruminate on that particular set of melodies for a while before it starts to get even stranger. And they jump back into that combination of this like fluttery guitar strum ending with a really harsh bar chord accent. It's almost sort of like an evil polka thing. And then it goes into, black thrash shit again. It's almost kind of tempting to say that Tartaros is better at being Emperor than Emperor were at this point in the 2000s, but honestly that does a disservice to Tartaros. Another high-quality, fucked-up, dissonant, percussive riff from Charman Grimbach. The poor drums have to be all over the place just to keep up with all the weird bendy shit the guitar is doing, and then into a nice atmospheric section. These slow sections would almost seem kind of calming if they weren't so tense and menacing. And that's what I mean, this ain't your grandpappy's symphonic black metal. It may be atmospheric, but it's not melancholic at all. It's just really mean and spooky and honestly very goofy, but in a way that's endearing instead of annoying. And it is for all those reasons that I think those two Tartaros albums are the greatest Halloween atmospheric black metal ever released. Completely unbeatable.
Or were they?
Well, to find out the answer to the question, who else is the contender for the Halloween spooky black metal throne, you're gonna have to tune into the next episode. Bye-bye.